This podcast is brought to you by North Carolina's electric cooperatives.
This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Welcome. You've heard and read the spin the media and the politicians have put on the issues of the day. To get the correct spin on what's going on in North Carolina, let's introduce you to our panel of experts. They include Syndicated columnist and author John Hood, former Supreme Court Justice Bob Orr, former Attorney General and former Secretary of State Rufus Edmisten, and Chris Fitzsimon, Director of the NC Policy Watch. Well, welcome to this 982nd edition of NC Spin. On this show, we're going to ask the panel to discuss redistricting maps released by both the House and Senate. We'll take on the topic of monuments and whether to remove those Confederate monuments from public grounds. We'll also ponder what to do with 14 local boards of elections that no longer have the requisite number of members. And as always, we'll ask the panel to tell us something we don't know. We've got a full show. Let's get started. Lawmakers are coming up against the deadline set by the court for approval of legislative redistricting maps. Last weekend, both houses of the legislature released their maps, and we want our panel to give you their analysis of what they proposed. I want to ask both Chris and John, give us your impressions of both the House and Senate maps. Chris, I'll start with you.
Well, I think they're not a surprise in the partisan makeup. I mean, I think the Republicans are doing what they have done, which is try to preserve their supermajority as close to it as they can. I think the real question is, what is the racial composition of the districts? They didn't use race as a criteria, but we're a voting rights state. So there has to be some basic ability for minority voters to elect a representative, a person of color. That's part of the whole voting rights system. I think that's going to be fascinating. I was disappointed, of course, that they didn't use, they didn't adopt some nonpartisan criteria. They double bunked some folks, but overall, this is a protection. This is the way this gerrymandering works. The Republicans protected themselves.
You don't sound like you're surprised.
No, I'm not surprised.
John Hood, what's your analysis?
Well, if I was going to do an impression of the maps, it would involve leaning to the right. But I mean, I already lean to the right, so I might fall over. It's a Republican-friendly set of maps. They're also relatively compact districts. We saw the same phenomenon with the congressional map. After it was struck down, the legislature redrew it. Still has a partisan tilt, but the districts themselves were more compact and understandable. That's kind of what happened here in lots of cases. You know, the squiggliest lines with legislative districts occur within counties. Not so much across county lines, because that's governed by the whole county provision, state constitution being harmonized with federal law. Within the county, you have a little more leeway, and that's where the squigglier lines tend to occur. This is pretty much a predictable kind of a thing, and these will be okay, my suspicion is, unless there is some sort of change in the federal courts regarding partisan gerrymandering as a standard.
But we don't know I think the big question is, what is the racial breakdown?
Yeah, and I was going to ask Bob Orr, doesn't the Justice Department have to approve these maps? And if they do, don't we have to comply with the Voting Rights Act of 1965?
Well, the court's going to have to approve the maps, and
well, the three-judge panel initially, but the Justice Department ultimately, aren't they?
Well, I don't think that it goes back now to the Justice Department.
For pre-clearance. I mean, essentially, this is going to go before that panel of judges, and then probably, I think, to the Supreme Court if they strike it.
Well, and you have to believe that the individuals drawing the maps know within reason what the court expects. And I agree with John, it's a much more compact set of maps. Sure, it favors the Republicans, but with the sophistication of voter data and computer technology, you know, it's easy to draw maps that tend to favor your political party, and that's the way the system has worked for years, even when the Democrats were in charge.
Rufus Bob Hall with Democracy North Carolina says that there are no more than 19 of the 170 legislative districts that are competitive.
And 10 in the Senate, maybe.
Do you agree with him?
I agree.
No, that's 19 total, House and Senate.
Good gracious, it's worse than I thought.
Yeah.
Yes, I agree with him, but I don't see that much difference in what the results are going to be under the old maps. And no matter what you do, you're going to have the concentration of African American votes in certain places, like we've all said here. You need to know where they are. Now, here again, this all boils down to the fact that when the Supreme Court and all the courts over the land have said over all the years that redistricting, absent some kind of a racial tone, is okay. That has caused both parties to do the most unbelievable things in the world.
But even in voting rights states?
It totally, until we get something done about nonpartisan redistricting, you're going to have this kind of plague the rest of your life. And Democrats were just as bad because I was defending them when I was Attorney General.
Yeah.
And
but it's also worth pointing out that Senator Berger introduced nonpartisan redistricting bill 5 times as late as 2009. It's also worth noting that House Rules Chair David Lewis sponsored one in 2011 that passed the House, and now he's changed his mind. So it is fascinating how power changes people's points of view.
Last Tuesday, in what was kind of fascinating, frankly, the legislature held simultaneous public hearings all across the state and allowed people to comment on these maps. John, I think it's fair to say the majority of people that spoke at those public hearings were pretty negative about them and didn't like them. Now, Republicans are saying, hey, the Democrats put them up to that. They noticed they all had the same talking points. Democrats said, these are just bad maps. What's your take on those public hearings?
If that was the Democrats' response, it was illogical. You might think it was bad maps. It certainly are partisan skewed maps. But it is unmistakably the case that many of the people at the hearings were all singing from the same sheet of music, and they had been orchestrated. You know, in a free society, you get to orchestrate things like that. This was not a random sample of people who happened to be wandering by the location. These are people who are motivated to come. They want redistricting reform, which I agree with. They are mostly Democrats who don't like the maps, which I understand. But yes, it was manufactured.
But wasn't it just
to
an
some extent.
exercise in futility, Chris? They didn't really want to hear what these people had to say.
Well, but I think it's important that they did, and I think there are a lot. I do think the momentum for redistricting reform is growing across North Carolina, not just among Democrats, but among rank and file Republicans too. And at some point, we're going to see this happen. I think this was an expression of that.
Bob, back to you. The 3-judge panel now is going to receive these maps when the legislature finally approves them.
Right.
All right. Do you have any insights how they might rule on them?
Well, I think they know what the first set of maps looked like. They'll see the changes. They'll evaluate those changes against the law. But before you cut me off, I got to quote Brad Crone, who is a frequent contributor on this panel, who said, regardless what the maps look like, the Democrats need to stop whining. And Brad's a Democrat consultant. He says you got to come up with better candidates, a strong platform, strong issues, and work hard. And you don't have to worry about what the maps
Well, you
look
do have
like.
to worry about the maps. I mean, there's going to be a handful of competitive seats, Bob.
Yeah, the key issue legally, it seems, from talking to attorneys who have been working on redistricting cases for decades, the Republicans have clearly in mind the U.S. Supreme Court. 4 of the justices would have upheld North Carolina's previous maps. 4 of the justices said no, they use race too much. One justice, Clarence Thomas, says don't use race at all. So he sided with the majority in the case, but that's why they did what they did. They are aiming to get that 5th vote.
But there was no dissent on the 3-judge panel throwing out these maps on the Supreme Court. The ruling where they didn't force a new election, but they ruled unanimously to uphold the 3-judge panel saying these are illegal racial gerrymandering.
Because the standard, which Clarence Thomas joined in a 5-4 decision about, was to decide how much race can be used. Clarence Thomas said yes. With the more liberal justices, he agreed. Yes, race was used too much, but his position is it shouldn't be used at all.
Mr. Attorney General, you had to defend these maps for many years. What's going to happen here?
Well, the wild card we're forgetting is President Trump. Now, this is an off year. The party
You talking about an off year for President Trump, or you just talking about?
It's an off year for everybody. Normally in midterms, they lose quite a few people. And is that enough to break the veto-proof majority? That's what everybody's thinking about. Is there enough to break the House? In one House, that's all Roy Cooper needs.
Just remember when they were drawing the congressional maps, Representative Lewis said openly in public, our job here is to draw 10 Republican districts out of 13. That's why we're here. Now, he didn't say that this time because there's a lawsuit moving through the courts.
Now, you're talking about congressional
Right,
maps.
but my point is, for Bob to say all you have to do is get good candidates and good issues, if the goal is to draw, in the congressional race, to draw 10 out of 13 Republicans, no matter what the state voters think, the same goal was here. He just didn't say it publicly because there's now litigation moving through the courts that challenges partisan gerrymandering.
I think there's only a smaller portion of the public that votes straight Republican regardless or straight Democrat regardless. So if you have a strong candidate with a well-financed campaign and a good message, I think virtually all but maybe 2 or 3 districts can be
Keep in
competitive.
mind that gerrymandering.
I have a bridge I'd like to talk to you about.
No. Before you dismiss Bob's point, we have recent evidence. Now, I'm not sure I would go as far as Bob, but gerrymanders do eventually fail.
Yes.
In 2010, the Republicans won some sizable majorities, not super majorities,
In Democratic
sizable
districts.
majorities in both houses with Democratic drawn
Districts that were approved, that were the first round of districts were thrown out, then Knox-Jenkins drew them, and then they had to be approved by the courts.
And then they were redrawn again.
Right, but these weren't the original
maps
districts.
did not stick either.
How
They were
bad will
redrawn again.
President Trump be doing, folks? You got to think that.
These districts were drawn by
You're taking us
Democrats,
to
not by the
2018.
judge.
All right, we want to remind you again that beginning Sunday, September 10th, NC Spin will no longer air on WRAL TV in the Raleigh-Durham market. On September 10th, you can find us on Fox 50 at our regular 6:30 a.m. time, also at 8:30 a.m. So be sure to mark your calendars and get more balanced debate for the Old North State on Fox 50 at 6:30, beginning Sunday, September 10th. When we come back, monumental reactions.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
In 2011, our farmers asked for 6,500 seasonal workers. Only 7 Americans showed up to work those jobs. Immigrant farm workers aren't stealing American jobs. To say otherwise ignores the facts. When farmers don't have enough skilled workers, crops go unharvested and farmers lose money. Consumers face fewer choices and higher prices. This is not acceptable. Tell Congress it's time to fix our broken immigration system.
The North Carolina General Assembly recently gave state retirees a well-deserved cost of living increase. Now local governments across North Carolina need to follow the legislature's lead and include retiree cost of living increases in their budgets. These increases are long overdue and desperately needed by all our retirees. The legislature heard us and they did what's right. It's time for local governments to do the same. Learn more at ncrgea.com.
We now return to NC Spin.
Much of the discussion recently is focused on whether or not to remove Confederate monuments from public areas, and we want our panel to give their opinions on this. Bob Orr and Rufus Edmisten, who better to talk about it than our former Attorney General and former Supreme Court Justice? What's your reaction to taking down these monuments, Bob Orr?
Well, we've talked a lot about it, and I think in the context of Confederate monuments as a single separate entity of monuments, I would say let's go very slowly. Let's have a solid public discourse and discussion, because I think it's really important. Where do you draw the line on monuments? Does this transcend to naming buildings on our university campuses? I mean, there are all sorts of implications. And I think it's a legitimate discussion as to who we should be honoring and memorializing, but to single out Confederate monuments, whether for individuals or for the broader group of service, I think would be a mistake just to do it in the spur of the moment. Let's have a serious discussion about where we go.
I think I heard about 45 seconds worth of no answer.
No, I said, I don't think, Baltimore went out and under the cover of night. I think that's just bad public policy. Let's have, it's a legitimate discussion as to whether some of these monuments or maybe all of them should stay or be removed or material provided that puts it in context. But, this sort of knee-jerk reaction to me isn't the way we need to be proceeding.
But meanwhile, we got all these protesters taking place. Rufus Edmisten, what's your take on this?
Who better not to want to talk about this than Rufus Edmisten? But other than that,
well, just do what Bob did.
No, I have a very definite opinion about this.
Yes, sir.
I passed by Silent Sam for years at Chapel Hill. I've been on the Capitol Board of Trustees for almost 25 years. And I've grown accustomed to that community of statues over there. And I'm pained to think about...
Talking about the state capitol.
State capitol. I'm pained to think about all these people like Zeb Vance and Aycock being moved away. I think we have to do something, as Bob said, and do it slowly. And why not do a memorial park at Bentonville for Confederate statues, done in an orderly way? There's only one down there that I know of. It is a significant battle. Why not have a Confederate memorial park when you do it slowly? And when I see a statue torn down, I am pained beyond belief.
Yeah, Bob, I'm sorry if I was
harsh.
Harsh, yes. Yeah. I do agree that there needs to be some deliberation about all of this. But in the meantime, we got 200 protesters over in Chapel Hill demanding that Silent Sam be removed. So it's kind of hard to take your time and have deliberations.
Well, I think important decisions merit taking your time and having all sides represented in the discussion. But I will say, like Rufus, for years I walked by Silent Sam. I always thought of it as simply a statue and memorializing the Confederate students who lost their lives. When you put it in the context of when it was erected during the white supremacy campaign and the remarks of Julian Carr, which were horrible, then I think it made it a much more legitimate issue that maybe this statue has no place on the university campus. But that's one statue, you know, and so.
But Chris, there are a lot of people that are saying these supporters, they're just being stoked up by outside agitators and professionals that are coming in here to try to create problems. You buy into that?
Well, I mean, there might be some people who aren't from here, but I think overall these are people in North Carolina protesting to take these monuments down. We have had this discussion for several years and for many decades about these monuments. The vast majority of them, including Silent Sam, as Bob mentioned, weren't put up right after the Civil War to honor the soldiers. They were put up during the height of the Jim Crow and white supremacist movement. And those words by Julian Carr, I would defy anybody to say that monument, those words were so offensive, I don't even want to repeat them. And they didn't raise a ruckus at the dedication ceremony by all the accounts that I have read. Some of the most racist, bigoted things I've ever heard. That's what that monument was about. Everybody there heard that speech. I think it's insane that monument is still there, and we can do it orderly. We don't have to tear them down, but we need to get on with it.
Well, John, one of the things that has been evident in all of this is we have seen evidence of vandals and violence and so forth associated with, for instance, the Duke Chapel with Robert E. Lee's statue being defaced and a statue being pulled down in Durham, and there are other situations like that. How do we separate the difference between actual protest versus what we are willing to condone so far as violence and vandalism?
Well, one of the tests would be if you're going to have a protest, first of all, you're not going to damage property, public or private, and you're also going to go through the proper channels. It isn't just that the memorial was yanked down by, frankly, some communists. These are actual communists, not just sort of made-up McCarthyist mythology, but actual communists who tore it down in Durham. That's not the worst. In some ways was several days later when, based on some unfounded rumors, hundreds and hundreds of people went downtown Durham and basically took over large swaths of it, blocked traffic even though they had no permit to do so. They thought, because they were very angry, they had strong opinions, and you can understand the opinions, they thought it was okay to take the law into their own hands. So did some of the people in other communities in North Carolina. You don't get to do that. We all have to live in situations where public officials do things we don't agree with. We can argue with it. We could try to, elect some different people and make some different policies, but you cannot take the law into your own hands. And that's the most important immediate problem, in my view, is to assure people that under no circumstances will any statues or memorials be taken down just because you threaten to deface them or you threaten to do something else. We're not going to stand for that kind of behavior.
It's also what's also worth noting, we passed a law in 2015, like the local governments around North Carolina, hundreds of them put up Confederate statues in the Jim Crow era on their own. Now the General Assembly passed a law that Governor McCrory signed that forbids those same local governments from taking them down. Well, for goodness sakes, if they were allowed to put up those things, why shouldn't the people in Whiteville or wherever it is have a debate and be able to take it down themselves? The law prohibits that.
Well, and Senator Berger says that ain't going to get changed.
Well,
We're going to do some business when we come back. We're going to talk about that lawsuit between the governor and the legislature on elections.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
The cost of everything has gone up dramatically over the last 75 years. With one exception, keeping electricity affordable. That's the power of your co-op membership. Learn more at togetherwesave.com.
North Carolina's Touchstone Energy Cooperatives, looking out for you.
I help educate and inspire visually impaired students to strive for a brighter future.
I make sure visitors to the North Carolina Zoo take a walk on the wild side.
And I make sure that the fuel you buy is a quality product from pipeline to pump.
I support small businesses in North Carolina by matching them with hard-working, well-trained employees.
I make sure the roads you drive on are safe.
Scenic, the one voice speaking in support of the men and women who are making North Carolina great.
You sleep on concrete till your body get immune to concrete.
My mom got my brother and I up and said, come on, we're leaving.
I became homeless in the beginning of this year.
When I was about 4 or 5 years old, our house caught fire.
I used to see my brother. If he see me, he'd turn and go the other direction.
We did the only thing that we could think of, and we went to a Salvation Army shelter.
You know, we don't have this, like, what's your background look like? We just say, what do you need?
I remember the man from the Salvation Army coming down with a box of clothes.
The Salvation Army officer bought my brother and I an ice cream cone.
Last week, my brother walked up to me, and he just started a conversation.
Today I've given my life to the Salvation Army because I remember what somebody did for me, my brother, and my mom over 30 years ago.
The Salvation Army for me means hope.
Compassion.
Family.
Support.
We now return to NC Spin.
The lawsuit between Governor Cooper and the legislature over the merger of the Ethics Commission and the State Board of Elections promised to cripple county boards of elections as local governments hold elections this fall. Now, the Supreme Court asked the counties to provide them with information as to how they were going to be affected by this unresolved lawsuit. Bob Orr, state law blocks county local election boards from taking any actions unless all 3 members of the local board are present. We got 14 counties that have at least one vacancy. What's going to happen as a result?
Well, I think you're going to see an order from the Supreme Court sometime in the next week or two that will amend the stay order to allow those local governments to answer any sort of electoral issues that might come up between now and when the case is ultimately resolved.
So the county boards will be able to take actions with just a 2-member board?
Well, I think it depends on what the Supreme Court says they can do.
One of the things, Rufus, was, because that was a proposal made to the court, if that is the case, it has to be a unanimous decision.
That's correct. These were the appointments not made by Governor Cooper. And there were mostly three members, and he hadn't appointed his, so he got 2. And I believe that they'll come back and say, okay, you can do it with 2. And then, obviously, it's got to be unanimous.
Could they possibly, Chris, force Governor Cooper to go ahead and make these appointments?
Well, it's interesting. On the main Ethics and Elections Board, the Supreme Court has said he can't make them until they rule. I think the best interest of everybody is the Supreme Court is going to hear this case next week. We need to go ahead and get a decision soon.
Yeah, John, this thing's been going on since December when the legislature in special session passed this law. We're in no man's land here. We don't have an ethics commission. I know
we have a serious gap here, an ambiguity. I think to resolve it, all local or state elections disputes should be appealable to the NC Spin panel. We always have 5 members, so you could do a majority vote. I think that would be an easy solution.
I'm ready to vote right now, as a matter of fact.
Oral arguments on Monday, the 28th at the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
We'll get an answer quickly.
Do you think so?
Yeah, I think they understand. They understand that we need an answer one way or the other.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to ask the panel to tell us something we don't know.
NC Spin is brought to you in part by the North Carolina Farm Bureau. The Farm Bureau and Agriculture. We keep North Carolina growing.
The healthcare landscape is filled with questions and uncertainties of changes that are coming. In these times of change, there's one thing you can trust. You can trust your family physician to work for you, not only in treating sickness and disease, but also your overall health. Regardless of how healthcare might change, the men and women of the North Carolina Academy of Family Physicians pledge to work upholding your trust. Family physicians, your trusted healthcare advisors.
I help educate and inspire visually impaired students to strive for a brighter future.
I make sure visitors to the North Carolina Zoo take a walk on the wild side.
And I make sure that the fuel you buy is a quality product from pipeline to pump.
I support small businesses in North Carolina by matching them with hard-working, well-trained employees.
I make sure the roads you drive on are safe.
Scenic, the one voice speaking in support of the men and women who are making North Carolina great.
We now return to NC Spin.
Viewer came up to me this past week and said, you know, it's worth watching your show just to hear the panel to tell us something we don't know. Well, it's that time. Rufus Edmisten, we start with you.
Well, in conjunction with our discussion about the monuments, I want to point out that North Carolina was a very divided state before the Civil War. We had people up in my neck of the woods that were with the Union. We supplied more troops to the whole effort. We had people, we had a husband and wife who fought for both the Confederacy and the Union in Watauga County. So let's keep that in mind.
And we lost more soldiers than any other state in the entire conflict. Because I understand we also had more deserters. Chris Fitzsimon, tell us something we don't know.
Not sure how to follow that. One of the most interesting issues, it's an environmental issue, is this chemical Gen X, but it's also turned out to be a political issue. Republicans are now trying to blame Governor Cooper. Well, some emails that have come to light in the last couple of months show that the McCord administration was not only notified of Gen X when they were in office, but they didn't turn that information over in information they gave to the incoming Cooper administration. I think Governor Cooper probably could have been quicker on the draw, but we're going to see a lot of ads, I think, in the next couple of years trying to blame each other for the Gen X disaster.
John Hood, tell us something we don't know.
One of the promising pieces or prominent pieces of legislation, maybe also promising, that passed the General Assembly is a so-called brunch bill that deregulated the sale of alcoholic beverages on Sundays. Over 100 local governments have already acted in response to the passage of that bill, authorizing restaurants to go ahead and begin selling, I think, at 10 a.m. in most cases. The rule used to be noon on Sundays.
Yeah. And I know they're very popular from what I'm
told. Their booze, won't they?
Yeah, they will. Bob Moore, tell us something we don't know.
We were talking about the proposed merger between the Ethics Commission and the State Board of Elections, and the Supreme Court has stayed that merger. But despite that, the Ethics Commission is having to move in literally to physical space with the Board of Elections, and there is already beginning this process of merging the two operations.
I know Perry Newsom's already left.
Despite the stay. So there's some question about, well, how can that be?
Well, you've heard our spin on the issues of the day. To stay informed all during the week, give your feedback, and read my weekly column, be sure to visit our website, ncspin.com, or catch NC Spin on Facebook. And join us next week when we'll have more balanced debate for the Old North State. Until then, stay informed and watch out for the spin.
Join us next week and get the spin on issues facing our state.